Now, if we put these burials together, this is what we get. And unfortunately, we had to excavate. We never found one burial until we finished the other burial. So we normally finish the burial and then took it out, and then we came across the other burial. And of course, this was towards the end of the project, and in archaeology we always say you're going to find your most important stuff at the end of your project, because that's when you're out of time and out of money and you've got to rush through. But so we reconstruct the site, and we see just a fascinating burial here, where we have three people obviously purposely buried in together. This is something we had never seen in the Bahamas before. I don't think we've even seen this elsewhere in the Caribbean. So this shows that we have something significant going on in the Bahamas that we haven't seen elsewhere. But what else do we find here? So I'm going to show a little more from this burial. So this is a close-up of some of the skull bones. And if you can see the lines crossed in there, that's actually impressions of basketry. So we know elsewhere in the Caribbean that some people were buried either laid on mats or wrapped in mats. And this is all across this person's skull. So we believe this person's head, at least at a minimum, we don't know what else because it was only the skull where, and the shoulders where it was preserved, was at least wrapped in some kind of basket and organically preserved on the skull. But let's go back to that one who was upside down that I told you about. So while we were excavating, we found this black substance across the arm. Originally, when we first saw it, we thought maybe it was a decayed worm or root or something. We tend to find those in archaeological sites. But a good archaeologist, we document everything. Take too many notes to know what to do with. So we noted it, drew it into our maps, photographed it. And we're glad we did, because we continue to excavate and we find better definition of it underneath him. Still don't know what it is. We removed the pelvis, and this is now the hands. Crossed, and it's going across the wrists. Oh. Now we're starting to rethink, is this person tied up? Still didn't know, but once we removed the hand, we actually saw that it was wrapped around the hands. Don't ask me how it preserved, but it preserved here. But this was actually wrapped around the hands, and the remainder of the rope, or whatever it was thrown to the side. So this person was tied up and buried face down. Okay, that's interesting, but what's even more interesting, at least to us, is this is the right humerus. This person was also stabbed in the back. So, sorry, the right humerus is your upper arm bone, and that's what you're looking at is the back part of the humerus. So this person was tied up, stabbed in the back, and buried. I don't know what he did to deserve this, but this actually shows something that we didn't know about in the Bahamas before. There's some sort of possibly ritualistic violence. If we know about the Mayans, and they did a lot of bloodletting, and blood was important to the Mayan. They sacrificed a lot of people. Here's a possible example of somebody being sacrificed for a burial. Don't know why, because this is the only time we've seen this in the Bahamas, but it's very important and very interesting. All right, so what else do we know about the Lucayans? Well, we know that the early Lucayans made and used shell beads, and lots of shell beads. This is just some examples of some shell beads from a site in the Turks and Caicos. We find them everywhere throughout the Bahamas. But we also know that beads itself were really important for status and rituals throughout the Caribbean. So that's an example of a shell belt that was found in Hispaniola. Well, what else do we know about the Lucayans? Cotton. We know that the Lucayans were extremely proficient with cotton. Columbus reports that they brought us sticks of cotton, and it was like candy thread. It was so well made. And just once again, just bringing the Lucayans back into the Bahamas. We know that found in Hispaniola we have what they call the cotton zemi, which is a zemi or a ritualistic object that's made out of cotton, but what's really interesting about it is that head is somebody's skull. So just to give you an example where I talked about in Preacher's Cave where the skull, the cranial was removed, here's an example of a burial somewhere else in the Caribbean where the skull had been removed and ritualized. We also know, and this is where the Bahamas becomes so much more important than the rest of the Caribbean. We know that there are duos in the Bahamas. I think everybody has heard of duos. The duos are ceremonial stools that we believe were used by the important people. I'm not going to say by the chiefs because we don't know. But what's interesting is that there have been more duos found in the Bahama archipelago than anywhere else. So a theory is that duos were made in the Bahamas and exported elsewhere to the Caribbean. So we know these Lucayans had trade networks, not just in the Bahamas anymore, they were still maintaining contacts with the Caribbean. And we also know that trade went both ways. So here's an example of some stone malls that were found in, the one on the left was found in North Caicos and the one on the right was found in Middle Caicos. So these are stone that are not native. If you know the Bahama geology, we don't have these kinds of stones. We're a limestone-based nation, so we know that there was still some kind of trade going back and forth between the Bahamas and the Great Antilles. And I showed you some stuff from the Turks and Caicos, and here, these axes, the ones on the top, were found throughout the Bahama Islands. So I'm showing you examples from Eleuthera, Great Inagua, and Ronquillo. That's the ones on the top. And then the actual axe on the bottom with the wooden handle still in place, that was found in the Turks and Caicos. So we know, once again, there is some sort of trade network between the Lucayans and the rest of the Caribbean. So what else do we know about the Lucayans? Well, we know that they performed some sort of slash and burn agriculture. They would eat stuff like corn, and originally a lot of the archaeologists didn't think corn was that significant to the diet. We're slowly beginning to change that theory because the more chemical tests we start to perform, the more examples of corn we find in the diet. So in Preacher's Cave, for example, we actually found a burnt corn kernel, and we know it was from the Lucayans and not the Eleutherian adventurers because, one, we radiocarbon dated, but also, two, it was the Indian corn. For those who don't know, corn before it's corn today was a lot smaller and had different morphology, so we know that corn was important. We also know that they ate different things. So we know they ate a lot of fish. We see examples of parrotfish throughout the record. We also find that they ate, or potentially ate, hutia. There's still a debate on whether they ate hutia or not. But we know that there's been examples found throughout the Bahamas, and especially in the southern islands. So Bill Keegan found in Crooked Island examples where it looked like they domesticated hutia. They found in Pete Zanelli, another archaeologist, found examples in Providenciales where it looked like they domesticated hutia. So I think the only reason you're going to domesticate a rodent that will eat everything that you leave around is to eat it yourself, because these things will destroy an environment if you let them run wild. We also know that shells and mollusks were incredibly important to them, not only from a dietary standpoint, tools also. So conch was incredibly important to the Lucayans. They ate it. They used it for everything else. So on the bottom there, I'm showing you an example of a conch shell pointer that possibly used to make beads. You have the conch shell gourd. We also know that they ate the West Indian top shell, they ate the chitons, and then here's an example of the Tellurian sunrise shell that I was talking about earlier that we found in the burial of the person, so for those who didn't know what it looked like. What else do we know about the Lucayans? Well, we know, and I'm going to show you why, I'm going to tell you why this one is wrong later on. We know that they bury their dead in caves, and not just regular dry caves. We find that they buried their dead in glue holes, They buried their dead in banana holes. They buried their dead in caves that are a combination of dry and wet. So you walk into the cave, it's dry, and then you continue along and you're in water. And I'll actually show you some examples of those burials. So we know that they buried their dead in caves, and the one on the top left is Preacher's Cave. So let's start off with some of the burials from caves. Well, this is an example from Pateman town, Edith Row, the one on the top. This is quite possibly the most robust indigenous person I have ever looked at, so the most muscular person. He was incredibly muscular. All of his bones just showed huge muscle attachments. But one of the most interesting things about this burial was that it was burnt. This wasn't just somebody who was buried. He was burnt. And what's incredibly interesting about this is if you look inside the skull, because of the burn, for some reason, the brain matter actually has survived. I've been asking different scientists, is there a way we can do some kind of study to understand more about the brain, but they say it's burnt, you can't do anything there. But that's a collection at the Peabody Museum at Yale. And then the bones on the bottom there were found in Preacher's Cave. And we found just a ton of bones, human bones, that had been burnt. And we're wondering, well, is this some sort of cremation burial, or is this some sort of ritualistic burning to remove flesh from the individual? We don't know. The one on the top may be to remove flesh because the fire wasn't as hot, the bones all survived. But the bones we found on the bottom, it's just, the fire was so hot that all of these bones broke up, and you can actually tell in the way they broke that they broke in the fire. So whoever that was burnt to a crisp. We find a lot of individuals with huge muscle attachments, and muscle attachments in areas where you can kind of determine use. So in a lot of the men, we find big muscle attachments right here between the humerus and the ulna and the radius. So some kind of repetitive motion over and over and over that's going to build those muscles. We know that Lucayans had a very harsh diet because we find, I think almost every individual I've looked at has had cavities. And not little cavities, some of them have had huge cavities. We've also seen some examples of some filing of the teeth. And this is something that I don't know if we've seen it elsewhere in the Caribbean, but I know it's been seen elsewhere in the Americas. So it's interesting to see that some Lucayans, let's just keep going out, file their teeth. We also know with the Lucayans that everyone, and I actually mean this time, I'm not going to contradict myself on this one, everybody did cranial deformation, or at least every burial that we have found has had the skull deformed. So basically, when they were babies, they would take a board, put it on the front, put another one on the back, and wrap it. So you have to think if you've ever felt a baby's head, and I have to admit I have squeezed a baby's head before. It's kind of fun. But, wow. But not too hard, just a little. But your skull is very malleable at the time, so they were able to shape everyone's their skull to be flattened. This is interesting because you do see this elsewhere in the Caribbean and elsewhere in the New World, but in a lot of cases you only see it for the elite. But we know the Lucayans, everybody did it. Is it a sign of beauty? Did it make their heads harder? Who knows? But one of the interesting side effects is that we know when they did this process, they actually created extra bones in the back of their skull. So for those who don't know, your skull isn't just one bone. It's made up of different bones. And in between those bones are what are called sutures, where they meet together. Well, sometimes these sutures would form new bones in between, and we call those wormian bones. I don't think that would cause any damage or anything, but it's just an interesting fact. We look at a lot of the dental wear. So I talked about the cavities. We actually see in a lot of individuals peg teeth. I've heard two explanations for this. Some have said it could be a genetic trait, And I'm hoping another study that we're working on can help us answer this question. And some have said it's an example of them using their teeth as a tool. So in some areas where you have leather, they'll put the leather in their mouth and use their teeth to work it. So you see that elsewhere, but I don't think there's no leather in the Bahamas. So, I mean, it may be a use-where, but with still something we're working on. We also find a lot of individuals where their teeth have broken off. So that's the one on the bottom right. And in some cases, we find entire populations. So the one on the top right, that's from Sanctuary Blue Hole, where we have recovered now approximately 20 remains, and there's still more in there. So this was a mass burial site. There are lines on the teeth called enamel hypoplasia. These are lines that were formed during high periods of stress in the diet. So we find that while these teeth were being formed, this entire population is basically every individual that where we have enough teeth to see it, they have these hypoplasia lines on it. And it's very interesting that everyone at Sanctuary has it. And all of the burials at Sanctuary dates around the same time period. So there was some, maybe famine, some hardship period that caused a lot of people stress in their diet. Earlier I talked about the possible of ritualistic violence. Here's another example of just violence. So this is an individual where we found a blunt force trauma on his skull. He actually survived this, and the bone started to grow back, so he didn't die from this wound. But what I circled there is the blunt force trauma, and you can see the bone growing back over it. Well, if we take Columbus's word, and you really can't, but I'm going to use him anyway, he says that he saw marks of wounds on their body, which somehow they told him they received defending themselves against people from other islands. I don't know how we would have had this conversation with people where they spoke different languages, but anyway, that's what. But you can see there that that person had a blunt force trauma, probably from some kind of blow to the head. I x-rayed it to get a better picture of it, and then I scanned the x-ray upside down. That's why it's a little awkward there. But we also see some negative effects from this cranial binding too. Here's an individual where it appears that the cranial binding was so tight that the bone, as a way to relieve pressure, grew up on top of itself. And you can actually, if you go to the other side of the skull, it's indented at that spot. So more than likely the binding was tied so tight that the only way that the bone relieved pressure was to grow over it. I don't know how painful that would have been, but it looks painful to me. We also know that the Lucayans had rock art. So this is various pictures from a cave in Rumkey called Hartford Cave. We know that they carved in the stone. We also know that they would draw also. I think Dr. Turner found something in Abaco, right? And we also found in Preacher's Cave, once again, we found a face where it was drawn in with charcoal. Unfortunately, it was so faint, but we were able to see this with some laser technology. So where did the Lucayans live? Well, we know, and I told you I'm going to contradict myself, and this isn't one of those cases where I will contradict myself. We know that they lived on the lee shore of most islands. In an area where there's some protected environment. You have to think, these were fishermen, did a little bit of farming. So where's the best place to live? Well, in a sheltered cove where you could pull up your canoe. There's a nice reef out there you could go fishing. We also know that the Lucayans made pottery, which we call palmetto-ware. For those who study archaeology, palmetto-ware is just a very crappy pottery. It's not well made. It has some designs on it, so sometimes we'll see etchings, so what I show on the bottom there. Sometimes we see baskets that are impressed onto the pottery, and that's actually how we were able to determine that the individual from Preacher's Cave had basketry marks, because of the study that was done on all these pottery baskets. So I told you earlier that I would show you something that I know to be wrong, but what sort of caused some of the confusion on migration into the Bahamas. So earlier I said Arawaks, and a lot of people still use the term Arawaks, and we know that term Arawak to be wrong for the first people in the Bahamas. but a lot of people would still say that they were descendant from those original Arawakan colonists. So originally archaeologists would say that migration into the New World, these people went all the way into Cuba. However, we don't fully believe that right now, because a lot of archaeology is coming out of Cuba, so we're able to reassess what we know about Cuba. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So these original Arawak people who came into the Caribbean, we know that they lived in circular villages. And we actually see this when you do archaeology.